Thanks, Nicola and Christelle, for asking me to come and speak. So I was just going to speak for a few minutes on choosing a mobile development strategy. I'd like to just share with everyone what the various technology options are for a mobile development strategy. We'll have a look at some of the data around it, look at the limitations of each approach, and then just go over some quick conclusions, some guidelines over which one is appropriate to choose when. Okay, so I thought I'd start with just a couple of slides on the fast growth of mobile. This will not come as any surprise to anybody here. Mobile's growing very fast. But these are some stats that I thought were really good illustrations of this. So this is the share of US search traffic on mobile, and that's growing from every quarter. So you can see even just from every 3 months to 3 month period, there's a very significant growth. It's about 3-4% every 3 or 4 months. So that's very, very fast. So you can see how right now, we're basically at 50-50 for mobile and desktop on search. And the other data point I thought was good was this one from PayPal. PayPal payments on mobile in 2009 were 140 million, and in 2014 were 4 billion. So that's quite a growth. Okay, so let's have a look at the options that you have when you're developing on mobile. I think you've got 5 basic options. Native apps, hybrid apps, a newer category that they're calling progressive apps. This is being pushed by Google. They started using the term about halfway through last year. Responsive websites, which is the most popular, I think, and dedicated mobile websites. And I'll just go over what each one of these are. So native apps are apps for a mobile device that are written in the language recommended by the maker of the operating system. Swift for iOS, used to be Objective-C, and Java for Android. And a good example is Grand Theft Auto. It's very hard to make Grand Theft Auto using any other technology. And hybrid apps. Hybrid apps are the name they give to apps that basically embed a web browser into a native app and then load up a web page in that web browser. And there's a lot of examples of apps, of app frameworks that use this technique. Sencha Touch used to be the #1 way of doing it. I think right now Ionic is the #1 way of doing it. And an example of this is the Zorka app that we'll have a look at in a few minutes. Progressive apps. So yeah, this is the kind of new category. These are mobile sites, responsive sites, that get upgraded to run full screen and have their own icon on a phone's home screen. An example is the Flipkart app. You know how you can, when you have a web page running in your browser on your mobile, you can add an icon to the home screen for that particular web page. You can add on a lot of other bits of functionality just through JavaScript, through the APIs that are available to JavaScript. You can have offline storage. You can cache your application's file so that it comes up really fast. You can get pretty close to what an actual mobile app does. And what Google is saying is, why not do that? Why not try and get really close to what a native app does just in a web page? That's what they're calling progressive apps. Responsive websites, so this is the most popular. That's just a web page that is aware of the layout of the browser that it's running in, so it adapts its layout to fit that browser. Pace.edu is a great example. The same website looks great on lots of different browsers, whether it's on a tiny, outdated iPhone 5S like mine, or on a giant screen. And the last one is dedicated mobile sites. So this is the approach taken by companies like Amazon, Citibank, who tend to have a lot of resources available to make the perfect web experience. And what they've done is they've decided, for mobile, let's just have a completely new application, tailor-made for that medium. So Amazon's got web pages that, when you look at it on a browser on a mobile, are quite different from what it looks like on desktop. It's not just a responsive site. The content is it's a different application, and it just looks different. So that's another option. Okay, so what are the key differences between those options? The biggest one is cost. especially if you're an entrepreneur. The most important thing, I think, is number of code bases. If, for example, you just have a responsive app, a responsive website for everything, for everybody, then you've effectively got one code base. Same with a progressive app, which is just like a sort of supercharged responsive app. You've basically got one code base for Android, for iOS, for web, for everybody, so that's cheaper. If you go the hybrid approach, or even, say, the React Native approach, you've got now two code bases. You've got your website, and then you've got a code base for your native app, which is the same for both Android and iOS, but you're on two code bases now. And if you go native, you've got many code bases. So obviously it's going to cost a lot more. The next one is performance. That's a very big difference. It's extremely important. Currently, the web is not as fast as native, as hard as it tries. Ionic does a fantastic job, but it's still not as silky smooth as native apps are. And that's a big deal. You want the phone to be an extension of the user. You want it to feel like a part of them. When they click on something, you want to get feedback back really quickly so that they feel it's a part of them, they love it, they use it all the time. It's hard if there's a lag there. If they do something, they wait a couple of, even portions of a second, and then it does something. It reminds them that it's a tool in their hand, and they don't interact with it in the same way. So cost and performance, I think, are the most important. Usability is also important. The web has built-in searchability, accessibility, printing. It's semantic. It's got fantastic security, and it doesn't need to be installed. These are all great benefits. I don't think they're quite as important as cost and performance when you're making your choice, but definitely worth keeping in mind. And I just wanted to add, React Native is now multi-platform. You probably know that, but the Android version of React Native came out in September of last year. So now you have one code base that goes to iOS and Android with React Native, which is great. Okay, so I was just going to look at some data around your choice of development methodology. What mobile platforms are customers using? And we're also going to look at what mobile platforms are businesses supporting. So there was a study that tracked over 1 billion active mobile devices, which said that US consumers spent an average of 150 minutes every day on phones and tablets. So that's over 2 hours. 2 hours and 7 minutes of that was in apps, and only 31 minutes was on a browser. So that's leaning heavily in favor of apps. And most people, the conventional wisdom is that that's right. People tend to spend more time on apps than in browsers. And here's a chart of what they're doing when they're on mobile in the US. And I think what's interesting here is, if you look at that chart, most of it is spent on gaming and on social. So on that chart, from like 12 o'clock through until like 8 o'clock, is kind of like gaming and social. And the rest of it is on the browser and other apps. So that's pretty interesting. That's showing that people have a routine every day. And if your app is considered part of their routine, they're going to use it a lot. And it's going to qualify to be downloaded, and they're going to install it. They're going to give it, they're going to consider it special. The desktop is still important. The desktop use hasn't fallen as mobile use has increased. So what's actually happening is we're just losing all our free time playing with computers. So desktop use is actually kind of kept pretty steady. Just mobile use has increased a lot. Okay. So internet went up 350% in 3 years, and desktop use went up 4%. Let's look at revenue. So this was a really interesting study just from a point of view of advertisers on the web. And they compared revenue between apps and revenue between the web. And as you can see, revenue is strongly, there's much more revenue coming from apps than there is from the web right now. And if you look at the world as a whole, you see that this information is quite different from region to region. Africa, say in the US, have pretty much opposite profiles when it comes to app versus web. So in Africa, the web is clearly the #1 way in which ad revenue is being created. In the States, apps are clearly the #1 way in which ad revenue is being created. And this is important. Ad revenue is very important for apps. Android and iOS differences for revenue on ads, it's about the same. Even though Android has a lot more traffic, I guess iOS people are richer because it's about 50-50. They get the same revenue from Android and iOS. Okay, and just more general information on app versus web. 12 of the top 50 mobile sites have more app traffic than web traffic, so most sites are getting more web traffic. Only 2 of the top US 30 retailers drove more than 50% of their visits via app, Amazon and Walmart. So for retailers, the web gets more traffic. And this was a survey asking online businesses where they were going to put their money. What are the top 3 initiatives and priorities for your online business in 2015? And #1, not surprisingly, was mobile. But what was interesting was that app development wasn't the most important part of that. Responsive design was. So 77% of retail said they had a mobile optimized site. 46% said they used responsive design. But interestingly, 56% of retailers said that apps are not a key component of their mobile strategy to customers. If you think about it, you have to work pretty hard to get your app on someone's phone. You have to be a part of their routine almost. You have to be very highly valued by them. So a lot of businesses just don't get to that level. Amazon, of course, has a fantastic app, so it gets used a lot, gets installed a lot. I thought it was just worth putting one slide on the bias towards the web you sometimes see. A lot of companies are web-based. They're interested in keeping people buying stuff on the web rather than in apps, in their own little private app worlds. They prefer everything to be on the web. I was watching a video a few weeks ago, and I remember someone on the video, the speaker, saying that 90% of revenue on Black Friday last year came from the web rather than apps. And I was quite surprised by that. 90% coming from the web rather than apps. And I found like a nice infographic on it on the web and someone's Twitter post. And it was out there. It wasn't strictly accurate. The sample of companies that used was basically a small group of brick and mortar stores who, they were big stores, they were well-known stores, but they were a group that kind of almost was like in the second tier, I think, of internet properties. And it was just on Black Friday. So it led to a number which was, I think, unrepresentative. And it got spread, but it's just important to bear in mind that for some companies like who do web-based ad spending, they're going to want to keep people on the web. So you should always keep that in mind when you're looking at these stats. So if you come across something that seems a little bit unlikely, just dig a bit deeper and see what's going on. Okay, I just wanted to talk about Facebook. There was a very well-known quote made by Mark Zuckerberg in 2012 when he said, "The biggest mistake we've made as a company is betting on HTML5 over native." And what Facebook did was they rewrote their Facebook app to be a hybrid HTML5 one to being a native one, or being native ones. That was very well known, and it was a warning signal for anyone doing hybrid development that to be a really great app, it's difficult if you're hybrid. I think it's worthwhile just seeing what else he said in that same speech. He said, it's not that HTML5 is bad. I'm actually, long-term, really excited about it. One of the things that is interesting us is that we actually have more people on a daily basis using mobile web Facebook than we have using our iOS and Android apps combined. So mobile web is a big thing for us. Nevertheless, they went with a native solution. And one of their Facebook engineering managers said, which I thought was, shed some really good light on this. Right now, Facebook moves fastest by writing native code. This isn't to say HTML5 won't ever be able to live up to the hype, but just that at this point, Moore's law and the web engines have some way to go. So we made a pragmatic decision. Even if HTML5 lets us move faster, you could expect eventually, if HTML5 lets us move faster, you could expect to see us move back to it. We're going to use whatever tech stack lets us do high-quality work at a fast pace. So they're being very pragmatic. They might move back. Okay. The native is extremely smooth, and even when React Native outputs compiles to native code, it's very smooth. Ionic is good as long as you stick to using CSS animations which sort of play to its strengths. If you animate properties like transform, position, scale, that kind of stuff, it's very, very smooth. And even the Ionic documentation, the website, it's very smooth. But it's noticeably not as smooth as a native app. You don't get the same frames per second. And so native apps still have the edge. So I'm going to jump to guidelines. So you want to respond to the user in 100 milliseconds. This was a nice chart showing that if you respond in under 100 milliseconds, the user's going to think that your response is pretty instant. 100 to 300 milliseconds, there's a small delay. So they might start getting the feeling that they're using a tool. Anything larger than that, and they're very aware that they're using something which is separate from them. And anything over 10 seconds, they're going to assume there's an error and just move on and use some other app or browser. So progressive web apps want to try and behave as much like native apps as possible. So they need to keep their time down to 100 milliseconds as much as they can. They have to initialize themselves very quickly. They have to enable themselves for offline use, and their animations have to be fast. Everything has to be fast to work well on a phone. So the question is HTML ready for 100 milliseconds? It is, but only if its pages are designed with this in mind. Designers have to be aware of the limitations of HTML if they're designing a hybrid app or a website to be able to pull this off. They can't just make any design and then expect it to work really well on HTML. Browsers are written to perform a different task than providing feedback in under 100 milliseconds. One of their main jobs is continuously updating page layout, which is a lot of work and will introduce jitters and animations. So you have to be very careful with the way in which you write hybrid apps and web pages to keep your site running very responsively. So one of the ways you can do this is making use of the phone's ability to save objects, images, code, HTML, anything, locally on the device. And as you can see here, mobile browsers and desktop browsers both have the same limits for local storage, which is the JavaScript object that lets you save. Basically 10 megabytes. So you have a lot of space there for your site. You can save your images, your code onto the device so that when you go to a site, it doesn't have to download everything off the web every time. It can just come up, be very snappy, give you fast initialization. It's called pre-caching. Good examples of this are the Guardian website, which saves all its local fonts that it uses, or all the fonts that it uses locally, so that it's a lot faster. And Morgan Stanley's Matrix application, which is a very large app that actually saves its entire application locally into its hybrid app, so that when it comes up, it's super fast. Okay, another advantage of this approach is that it enables offline use. There's a new feature in HTML called service workers that basically allows you to intercept network calls and act as a proxy for network calls in a JavaScript app. So what you can do now in your app is that proxy can, when the app asks for a network object, you know you're offline, but you don't have to tell the app that. You can, well, you can inform the app, but basically you can allow the app to keep working, even though it's offline. You can batch up all the network connections, the info that it's trying to save to the network, and when you get connected, you can then save them all. But it allows apps to work offline. So all this allows a web page or a hybrid app to approximate a native app more and more. Animating is also a very important topic. A web page that or a hybrid app that wants to appear native-like should try and shift its animations to the GPU as much as possible. So don't use JavaScript for animations, use CSS as much as you can. When you are using CSS, use properties like transform, scale, opacity, width and height, that kind of stuff, that scale very quickly to give that silky smooth animated feeling. Okay, so let's have a look at some conclusions. The first mobile need for most companies is a website that works on both desktop and mobile. Most companies are just going to want a website that's responsive, works really well, gets customers in. Multi-threading, offline storage, hardware-based animations, and mobile hardware APIs have enabled mobile websites to close the functionality gap between themselves and native apps. You can make the phone vibrate now through JavaScript. You can do a lot of cool stuff using the phone's hardware with JavaScript. So it's really closed the gap. So over time, there's this definite move towards the web catching up with native. But right now, it still can't currently compete with native on responsiveness and animation. But probably in the future, my guess is it will. When you're comparing the best hybrid apps with average native ones, the native apps are still noticeably more pleasant to use. Frameworks that implement mobile conventions and UI controls will greatly speed your development and reduce your code bases, like React Native. So having fewer code bases is cheaper and increases developer flexibility. You'll be able to move developers from one project onto another. That's really important, and that's why frameworks like React Mobile are very attractive right now. So in closing, until the web has better performance and more powerful APIs, native apps will remain the preferred technology for building mobile apps. But HTML-based apps and responsive websites are very cost efficient and are pretty close to what native apps can do. So that was it. Thank you.